Hi guys, welcome back to exmolex. So this week I was going to be doing a part 2 about the doubting missionary stories that I did last week. However, something came up this week that I just feel like it's really important to talk about, and I want to get it out there right now. So next week we'll continue the doubting missionary stories, but this week I want to talk about something else. I don't know how new this is, but it's something that I only just became aware of, and I want to make other people aware of it too. If you have children especially, I think you'll want to hear about this. So the LDS Church has a collection of scripture stories on their website. If you grew up in the church, you're probably somewhat familiar with things like this. When I was a kid, we had the Book of Mormon scripture stories. It's basically like a comic that goes through all of the stories in the Book of Mormon. Now, the LDS Church, like I said, I'm not sure how new this is, but it came up on my Facebook feed that the LDS Church has this Doctrine and Covenants scripture stories version on their website now. Now, these little comic books basically are directed at children, and there is a chapter on plural marriage. Now, I want to go through this with you and talk about what I think about it and hear your thoughts on it as well. Plural marriage, faith to obey a law from the Lord even when it's hard. While the prophet Joseph was studying the Bible, he read about prophets like Abraham and Moses who had been married to more than one wife. Joseph wondered how the Lord felt about that, so he decided to ask the Lord. The Lord said that usually a man should have only one wife, but sometimes the Lord commanded his people to be in marriages of one man and more than one woman. This was called plural marriage. The Lord told Joseph that his people should only be in plural marriages if he commands it. A few years later, the Lord told Joseph to marry other women. Joseph didn't want to marry other wives, but he knew it was a commandment from the Lord. When Joseph asked a woman to marry him, he told her to pray about it. He wanted her to know from the Lord that it was right. This commandment was also hard for Joseph's first wife, Emma. Sometimes Emma helped Joseph decide who he should ask to marry him. Other times, Emma did not want Joseph to marry other women. Joseph taught the 12 apostles about plural marriage. It was a hard commandment for them too. Brigham Young and his wife, Mary Ann, prayed a lot to the Lord about what to do. They learned that they should obey the commandment of plural marriage. For many years, some of the saints were asked to be in plural marriages. People outside the church did not like plural marriage. Wonder why? They made laws against it. Some saints, including church leaders, were put in prison. But the Lord blessed the families who obeyed his commandments, even when it was hard. In 1890, the Lord told Wilford Woodruff, the president of the church, that men should not marry more than one wife anymore. The leaders of the church shared this commandment with the saints. This is still the Lord's commandment today. A man should be married to only one wife. Here are some of my initial thoughts about this. First of all, I think this is grooming. If we just take this chapter at face value, it's a whitewashed version of the story of polygamy. And you might say, well, at least they're finally actually talking about it, because when I grew up in the church, I had no idea that Joseph Smith had so many wives. I didn't know anything about them. And again, this talks about plural marriage, and it opens up that Joseph Smith has multiple wives, but we don't learn any of their names other than his first wife, Emma. We don't learn about their ages. We don't learn about their circumstances. We don't learn about any of that. It's very, very basic. And obviously, again, this is for children. But if we're going to talk about plural marriage and talk about how we have to do hard things because the Lord said to, you should open up it about all exactly of what those hard things were, because this is such like a light version of it. If you define what grooming actually is, it is the practice of preparing or training someone for a particular purpose or activity. This whole chapter is teaching children to be obedient to their leaders even when it's hard. The particular thing that we're talking about in this scenario, the thing that's hard to do but you should do it anyway, is marrying, having sexual relations with those leaders. Now, as somebody whose bishop used his position of power to sexually abuse children, the friends that I grew up with, I think that putting a lesson like this in a book for children is sick and wrong. It is so harmful to teach children that they must obey their leaders, even if they're telling them to do a hard thing because the leader said that God said they need to. Instead of this, we should be teaching kids that it's okay to say no. This is one of the reasons that I feel like ingraining in children from such a young age to always be obedient and emphasizing obedience in every conference talk every lesson is so harmful. Teach your kids that it is okay to say no to a leader. Honoring yourself and your own needs and your own desires. Standing up for yourself, saying no, enforcing boundaries. Especially when the thing that the leader is asking you to do is logically an immoral thing. Okay, so that's just number one. I feel like this is grooming. The second thing that really stuck out to me is how much it's emphasized that this commandment of plural marriage was really hard for Joseph and really hard for Brigham. They mentioned one time that it was hard for Emma, but we don't hear about any of the other plural wives. If you've watched this video that I did a year or two ago, I talked about the plural marriage of one of my ancestors and just how absolutely horrible that was for her. It's honestly not very often that we get to see this side of how difficult polygamy was, especially for women, because a lot of that history has been erased. But luckily I still have the records of this pioneer woman, Melissa, whose husband left her to go on a mission and brought back 3 younger sisters, married them all, and got them all pregnant immediately. I highly recommend checking out her entire story. But her life was so difficult. She had a really, really rough time even before the polygamy, but the polygamy was especially difficult for her. It's hard to imagine just how difficult it was for her. But again, it really sticks out to me that this book, this chapter in this book, doesn't really mention how difficult this was for the women. It focuses on, oh, poor Joseph and oh, poor Brigham. They had to take multiple wives. Why is it that God's plans always seem to harm women? And you know, I've heard all of the arguments about how, oh, these men were just taking multiple wives because they needed to be taken care of and they had nobody, and so they had to go with these men so that they would have somebody to take care of them, and bullshit. If we're totally open, instead of whitewashing it, if we're open about all of the wives that Joseph Smith took, many of them already had husbands. He took wives who were already married to other men that he had sent on missions. He married children who had parents to take care of them. Editing Lex here, I also just had to mention that with these whole, oh, the men just had to take care of the women, so they took these wives just so that they could take care of them, is ridiculous. Not only because, like, you don't have to marry a woman to take care of her, but also because this pioneer ancestor that I had, and she's not technically my grandmother, Melissa was actually one of the polygamous wives of my great-great-great-grandfather. But taking those other 3 younger wives that he took because he was taking care of them is a stupid claim. Once he had all of these extra wives, at this point he's at 4 current wives. Even he had another one too, but 4 current wives and dozens of children. He could not support them. He couldn't take care of them. Because who can support 4 wives and like 45 children? Nobody. So Melissa was living in squalor without so much as a bed. Brigham Young saw the shitty conditions that she was living in and brought her a bed, and then her husband gave that bed away to one of his other wives' children. And that's the way that she lived. Like, that's just how it was for her. She was absolutely miserable. She was seeking divorce. She was trying to get out of the crappy situation that she was in. So don't tell me that they were marrying these wives because they just were taking care of these women who had no one. She would have been much better taken care of if she had stayed away from him and instead left the church and gone back to her family who was begging her to come back. In fact, I saw these other cartoons that I think somebody made as like a more realistic version or like a parody of the church putting out this whitewashed version, where it talks about how God sent an angel with a flaming sword to destroy Joseph if he didn't start marrying other wives, where it talks about Fanny Alger in the barn. This one, when Joseph's friend Oliver Cowdery learned that Joseph was practicing plural marriage with Fanny Alger in the barn, Oliver thought Joseph was doing something wrong. Oliver told other people that Joseph should not do that. Joseph excommunicated Oliver from the church for criticizing him. Joseph had to do hard things to follow God's will and marry many women. We can do hard things too, even if we have to lose friends. It also talks about the really important fact that Emma was lied to. Joseph lied to Emma about many of these marriages, which obviously the original cartoon didn't include. This line is so poignant. It's hard to do what the Lord wants, but it's important to follow his will, even if you have to lie to someone. If you're gonna tell the story, tell the full story and say it with your chest. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to share Melissa's story, because I feel like there are not enough perspectives out there of what these women actually went through and how difficult and tragic their lives were as a result. And again, with this chapter, we go back to the fact that it is targeting children, teaching them that they must be obedient to their leaders even when it's hard, teaching them not to trust themselves. Let's tell it like it is. Joseph Smith was a predator. He used coercion and threats and lies, sent men on missions so that he could bed their wives, called it a marriage, but it's abusive, and all of that secretively. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about this. I feel like the church is being more open in a way by letting kids know right off the bat that Joseph Smith had many wives and that it was hard, but leaving out huge chunks of the story, not going into the fact that this was the hardest on the women, that they're treated like cattle, and framing it in a way where we all have to do hard things. The Lord sometimes commands us to do hard things, and sometimes our leaders have to do hard things, and we just need to be obedient and trust them. I think these are super harmful messages to teach children. Knowing just how many Mormon leader sex offenders have been in the news, and those are just the ones that got caught, right? And having this be something that has touched my life and the people around me in a really impactful way, it makes me sick. Kids need to be taught about critical thinking, thinking for themselves, standing up for themselves, saying no to things that are wrong, using their own moral judgment, setting up boundaries, caring for themselves, not just blindly trusting and being obedient to authority figures because God said so. If you're a member of the church, or if you're physically and mentally out, if you've got children that are going to church, I beg you to make sure you're reinforcing the right messages. Don't let your kids go to church, learn lessons like this, and think that they just need to accept what their leaders tell them, because we all have to do hard things. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I'm sorry if I got a little bit heated with this one, but this is just, as a mom, it's so upsetting. It's so upsetting that these are the messages that children are getting at church. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Protect your children. Thank you so much for being here. Special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and the work that I do here. Extra special thank you to Doug Davis for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. If you would like to support the channel, there's links to do so in the description below. Thank you for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye.